The eviction notice was printed on cheap, bright yellow paper, the kind that screams for attention in a mailbox stuffed with bills, coupons, and junk mail. Arthur Penhaligon stood in the center of his kitchen, STA ring at the bold, black letters. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the Formica countertop. The laminate was peeling at the corners, a silent testament to 40 Rs of spilled coffee, burnt toast, and silent dinners in a house that had long ceased to be a home. Sign it, Arthur. Just sign the damn thing. The voice belonged to his son, Brad. Brad was pacing the faded linoleum floor, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking a frantic, impatient rhythm. He was 42, wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Arthur's first CAR, and possessed the emotional depth of a puddle. Behind him stood Arthur's daughter-in-law, Chloe, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. She didn't even bother to look at the man she was about to make homeless. "That it's a good deal, Dad," Brad said, his tone dripping with that condescending sweetness reserved for toddlers and the senile. "The assisted living facility in Boca is nice. We've already paid the deposit. You can't manage this place anymore. You forget to take your pills. You leave the stove on. It's a liability." Arthur didn't look at his son. He kept his eyes fixed on the yellow paper. 30 days to vacate. He remembered the day he bought this house. 1982. He had seen ride Chloe across the threshold, back when she was still his daughter-in-law, back when she used to call him Dad instead of Arthur, back before the slow, corrosive acid of their resentment had eaten through the foundation of their family. They didn't see a father anymore. They saw a decaying asset, a mortgage payment they were tired of making, a ghost haunting their suburban paratus. "I'm not signing it," Arthur said. His voice was quiet, but it ride the rough texture of gravel that Brad stopped pacing. He leaned over the counter, invading Arthur's space, smelling of expensive cologne and stale scotch. "Don't be difficult. We have the power of attorney. We can sign it for you. We're just giving you the dignity of doing it yourself." "Dignity," Arthur repeated. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He turned and walked slowly to RD, the hallway closet. Brad and Chloe exchanged a look of triumphant relief. Finally, the old man is getting his coat. But Arthur didn't reach for his coat. He reached for the false panel hidden behind the winter boots. His fingers, G&A roulette with arthritis, but steady with purpose, found the hidden latch. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was heavy, smelling of old paper, dust, and iron that he dropped on the kitchen table. The dull thud silenced the room. "That you want to talk about liabilities, Brad?" Arthur asked, his eyes finally locking onto his son's. The milky haze of age was gone, replaced by a gaze so sharp it could cut glass. "You want to talk about what you think you own?" Brad read at the book, bewildered. "What is that, some you gonna read us poetry? This," Arthur said, resting his weathered hand on the cover, "is the reason you're standing in my kitchen. And it's the reason you're going to beg me to let you stay." He opened the book to a page marked with a faded red ribbon. He slid it across the table. Brad looked down. His face, already ruddy from drink and arrogance, drained of color. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to clear a hallucination. He looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. Then he looked at Arthur. "Dad, this is dated 1998. "I know the date," Arthur said softly. "I also know that the account linked to this signature has been compounding interest, untouched, for 30 Rs. The bank manager, Mr. Henderson, called me this morning. He wanted to know if I was still alive. He said the Qua Rudely statement is ready for review." Chloe looked up from her phone, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. "What account? What are you talking about?" Arthur closed the book. The sound was like a gavel striking a block. "The account," Arthur said, his voice steady and absolute, "that holds the controlling Shah residential of Penhaligon Holdings. The company you've been trying to sell off for RTS for the last 5 years. The company that owns the mortgage on this house. The company that, as of this morning, has terminated your employment as regional vice president due to gross mismanagement of family assets." Brad's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dock. "You threw away my mail. Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that Aro read in the silence. You thought I was just an old man who didn't know the difference between a utility bill and a death warrant. But you forgot one thing, Brad. Arthur leaned in, his face inches from his son's. I built the maze you're lost in, and I'm the only one who knows the way out. He picked up the eviction notice. With a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it in half. Then in quadrants, he let the yellow confetti drift to the floor. Then now, Arthur said, pointing to the door, get out of my house. You have 30 seconds before I call Mr. Henderson and have him freeze the credit CARDS you're using to pay for that suit. Brad didn't move. He couldn't. The arrogance had been surgically removed, leaving only a hollow, terrified shell. 20 seconds, Arthur said, checking his watch. Chloe grabbed Brad's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Brad, move. They stumbled backway, tripping over their own feet, the polished shoes scuffing against the peeling linoleum. They didn't look back. They didn't hurry when the front door slammed. The silence that followed was heavy. But for the first time in 20 years, it wasn't the silence of oppression, it was the silence of peace. Arthur walked to the window and watched his son CAR peel out of the driveway, tires screaming against the asphalt. He didn't smile. Smiling was for people who had something to prove. He had nothing left to prove. He just had a life to reclaim. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. Mr. Henderson, Arthur said when the line connected. Yes, I'm alive, and I'm ready to come in. We have a lot of restructuring to do. He hung up. He looked at the yellow scraps on the floor. My son threw it away, he thought. But the bank manager remembered. Arthur Penhaligon walked to the kitchen, put on the kettle, and for the first time in decades, he made himself a cup of tea. Strong, black, no sugar, just the way he liked it. The glass-walled headquarters of Penhaligon Holdings stood like a monument to modern arrogance in the heart of downtown. Inside, on the 42nd floor, the executive boardroom was a theater of whispered betrayals. Brad sat at the head of the mahogany table, his knuckles white as he gripped his leather portfolio. The air conditioning was humming, but he was sweating. The eviction notice had been a disaster, but he had spent the last 48 hours spinning a narrative. He had called the company's legal counsel, his private physician, and 3 key BOA RD members. The story was simple. Arthur was suffering from advanced dementia, a tragic but manageable decline, and Brad was stepping up to protect the family's legacy from a senile man's destructive impulses. Brad, are you sure about this? Asked Mayor Cus Vance, the chief financial officer, a man whose loyalty was as flexible as a rubber band. If Arthur can test the competency he ring, this could get messy. The press loves a story about a ruthless son locking up his own father. He won't contest it, Mayor Cus, Brad replied, his voice tight, but forced into a confident BA right tone. I've seen him. He's talking to himself. He's paranoid. He thinks he's still running the company. It's sad, really, but we have a fiducia duty to the Shari holders. We can't let a sick old man tank a multi-billion-dollar our enterprise. Chloe sat beside him, playing the role of the devoted daughter-in-law perfectly. He's just so confused, Mayor Cus. Yesterday, he asked me where his secret ledger was. It's here at breaking. Brad checked his Rolex. 9:58 a.m. The vote to declare Arthur mentally incapacitated and transfer full voting rights to Brad was scheduled for 10 a.m. SHA-RP. Once signed, the house, the accounts, and the company would be entirely his. He would sell off the manufacturing division, lay off 2,000 workers, and take his golden parachute. At exactly 10 a.m., the heavy oak doors of the Boa Rouge room didn't just open. They were pushed wide with a quiet, deliberate force. The conversation died in the throats of the executives. Arthur Penhaligon walked in. He was not wearing the faded CA Rudigan and slippers they had expected. He wore a bespoke charcoal 3-piece suit, tailored in London 30 years ago and preserved with meticulous CA. His silver hair was combed back, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room with the cold precision of a hawk assessing a field of mice. But it was the man walking half a step behind him that made the blood drain from Brad's face. Elias Henderson, the senior managing partner of First Heritage Trust, the man who held the keys to the Penhaligon Family Trust, the man who, according to Brad's serifully constructed lie, had been managing Arthur's dwindling, confused affairs. Brad stood up, his chair scraping violently against the roadwood floor. Dad, what are you doing here, Mr. Henderson? I thought we agreed. Sit down, Brad, Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but its ride to every corner of the silent room, resonating with an authority that hadn't been in these halls for 2 decades. Brad didn't sit. He couldn't. Americus, call security. He's having an episode. He's trespassing. Elias Henderson didn't even blink. He walked calmly to the head of the table, placed a thick, embossed leather folder on the polished wood, and rested his hands on the back of the chair. He looked at Brad with the mild, clinical pity a doctor reserves for a terminal patient. Mr. Penhaligon is not trespassing. Mr. Penhaligon, Jr., Henderson said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. He is the sole owner of this building, this company, and, as of this morning, the sole signatory on all corporate accounts. I suggest you take your seat before you harass yourself further. Brad looked at Americus, desperate for an ally. But the CFO was staring at Henderson's folder, his eyes wide with sudden, dawning terror. Americus knew what that folder was. Every executive in the room knew what that folder was. It was the original 1998 irrevocable trust agreement. The document that Brad had been told was lost in a flood. The document that made Arthur untouchable that Brad's legs gave out. He collapsed back in his chair, his chest heaving. Arthur walked slowly to the opposite end of the table. He didn't take the head seat. He took the seat to the left of it, the seat his own father had sat in. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked at his son. You've been busy, Brad, Arthur began, his tone conversational, almost gentle. Selling off assets, firing middle management, cutting R&D. You've been bleeding this company dry to fund your lifestyle, your wife's shopping habits, and your desperate need to feel important. Brad opened his mouth, but only a dry croak emerged. I was saving the company. You were looting it, Arthur corrected softly. He nodded to Henderson. Henderson opened the folder. Mr. Penhaligon has spent the last 48 hours reviewing the company's internal audits. Audits that you attempted to bury, Brad. We found the shell companies in the Caymans. We found the unauthorized loans you took against the pension fund to cover your margin calls. We found the emails where you referred to your father as the ghost and discussed forging medical documents to seize control. Chloe let out a small, strangled gasp. Her phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table. The devoted daughter-in-law act evaporated, leaving behind a terrified woman watching her husband's empire turn to ash in real time. Arthur leaned forward, RD, resting his 4A RMS on the table. You thought I was a ghost, Brad. You thought because I stopped speaking, I stopped seeing. You thought because I let you play see, I had forgotten how to be one. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped perfectly in front of Brad. It was a termination notice. Printed on heavy, cream-colored CA rootstock, your employment with Penhaligon Holdings is terminated, effective immediately, Arthur said. For cause, gross negligence, fiducia re-breach, and attempted fraud. Brad STA read at the paper. His hand was shaking so violently he couldn't pick it up. You can't do this. I'm your son. The BOA RD will never vote for this. They know me. They know the man you pretended to be, Arthur replied. But as of 8 o'clock this morning, I have reconstituted the BOA Road Americus. The CFO didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at Brad. Yes, Mr. Penhaligon. The new BOA RD members have already signed the ratification. Your authority is absolute. Brad looked around the room. 12 faces. 12 people he had bought drinks for, people he had laughed with, people he had promised promotions to. Not one of them met his eyes. They were all STA ring at Arthur, waiting for their next instruction. He was already a ghost, and there's one more thing. Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a register that made the temperature in the room seem to plummet. The mortgage on my house. The one you used as collateral for your Cayman Shell company. Brad's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. Dad, please, the bank has foreclosed on your personal assets as of this morning. Arthur said, his face a mask of granite. You are currently $3 million RS in debt to entities you cannot name, in jurisdictions you cannot reach. You have no corporate credit. You have no personal liquidity. And you have no home. Arthur stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and final. You wanted to put me in a facility in Boca, Brad. You wanted to strip me of my dignity and lock me in a room where I couldn't bother you anymore. Arthur walked around the table, stopping beside his son's chair. He leaned down, his mouth inches from Brad's ear. I have arranged for a much more suitable facility for you, Arthur whispered. It's a federal minimum security camp in Pennsylvania. Mr. Henderson has already spoken to the Warden. You'll be joining them on Monday. Brad's breath hitched. A tear, hot and shameful, rolled down his cheek. He looked up at his father, his eyes begging for a mercy he had never shown. Dad, please. I'm sorry. I was SCA red. I just wanted to be like you. Arthur looked down at his son. For a fleeting second, the ghost of the father who had taught Brad to ride a bicycle flickered in his eyes. But the man standing before him was a stranger, a Parazit that had mistaken the host for a corpse. No, Brad, Arthur said softly. You wanted to be me, but you lacked the one thing that made me who I am. He straightened up, buttoning his suit jacket. You lacked honor. Arthur turned and walked toward the door. Elias Henderson fell in a step beside him. The executive's paw root like the Red Sea as they passed. Arthur paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. He didn't look back. That security will escort you out, Brad. I suggest you pack a bag. You won't be needing the Italian leather shoes anymore. He opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the silence of absolute, irreversible ruin in his wake. As the elevator doors closed, sealing him in a quiet, mirrored box, Arthur Penhaligon let out a long, slow breath. The weight of 20 RS of betrayal lifted from his shoulders. He wasn't happy. Happiness was a fleeting thing. But he was free. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. Hello, say Ra, he said, his voice softening, the gravel melting into RMTH. Yes. It's done. I'm on my way back to the house. Put the kettle on. I think I'd like some tea. He hung up. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. The old man STA ringed back wasn't a ghost anymore, that he was a Arthur Penhaligon. And he was just getting STA root that the silence in the Penhaligon house was no longer heavy with oppression. It was light, breathable, and smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh tea. Arthur sat in his worn leather A-room chair, the one he had bought the day he closed his first major real estate deal in 1985. The ceramic mug in his hands was Wa-Arim, grounding him in the present. He had expected peace. He had expected the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally taken out the trash. But the universe, and the people he had raised, had other plans. The front door burst open, shattering the tranquility. Chloe stood in the foyer, her chest heaving, her mask already running into RK, jagged streaks down her cheeks. Behind her, holding her hand with a white-knuckled grip, was Leo, Arthur's grandson. The boy was 14, tall for his age, wearing a hoodie and a look of profound, confused hostility. Where's he? Chloe's voice was a shrill, desperate rasp. She didn't look at Arthur. She scanned the living room as if expecting Brad to be hiding behind the sofa. Where's my husband? Arthur took a slow sip of his tea. He has been relieved of his duties, Chloe. As have you, by extension. Chloe finally snapped her gaze toward him. The polished, indifferent daughter-in-law was gone. In her place was a cornered animal, stripped of her safety net. You fired him. Do you have any idea what you've done? We have a mortgage. We have private school tuition. We have a life. You had a lifestyle, Arthur corrected gently, setting the mug down. Funded by my life. That ends today. Grandpa, what the hell is wrong with you? Leo's voice cracked, thick with adolescent rage and reneged loyalty. He stepped forward. positioning himself between Arthur and his mother like a human shield. You're just some bitter old man who hates us. Mom says you've been jealous of Dad since he took over the company. You're ruining everything because you're pathetic. The words hung in the air, toxic and shot RP. Arthur looked at his grandson. He saw the boy's trembling jaw, the desperate need to protect his mother, the misguided sense of honor. Arthur remembered when Leo was 6, sitting on this very rug, building wooden blocks, and asking Arthur to tell him stories about the men who built steel mills and railroads. He remembered the weight of the boy's small hand in his own now. That hand was curled into a fist, aimed at him. But is that what she tells you? Arthur asked, his voice devoid of anger. Ca, Rhine only a profound, ancient sadness. That I am bitter. That I am pathetic. She says you're a dinosaur. Leo shouted, TRS of frustration welling in his eyes. She says you don't understand the modern world, that you're just trying to control us because you're SCA, red of dying alone. Chloe, seeing an opening, immediately shifted tactics. The anger melted into a practiced, devastating performance of grief. She sank onto the edge of the sofa, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with manufactured sobs. He's right, Arthur. She wept, looking up at him with red-rimmed, pleading eyes. We've made mistakes. Brad has made mistakes. But he's your son. He's Leo's father. Are you really going to throw him to the wolves over money? Over a house, please. I'm begging you. Think of Leo. Do you want him to grow up knowing his grandfather destroyed his father? It was the ultimate weapon. The guilt trip. The invocation of blood and legacy. For 20 RS, this exact maneuver had forced Arthur to sign checks, to look the other way, to swallow his pride and endure their contempt. They had weaponized his love for his grandson against him. Arthur stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of Leo at 10 RS old, missing his 2 front teeth, holding a trophy at a Little League championship. Arthur had been the one to coach that team. Arthur had been the one to drive him to every practice while Brad was at business dinners that were actually benders at the country club. He walked back and held the photo out to Leo. The boy hesitated, then snatched it, GLA ring at his grandfather. Do you remember that day, Leo? Arthur asked softly. You struck out 3 times in the championship game. You were devastated. You threw your glove in the dirt and cried. Leo's jaw tightened. He remembered. Do you remember what I told you? Arthur continued, his eyes locked on the boys. I told you that striking out doesn't make you a failure. Quitting does. I told you that a man's worth isn't measured by the trophies he wins, but by how he rise himself when he loses. Arthur took a step closer. Your father didn't just strike out, Leo. He cheated. He stole from the pension fund. He forged medical documents to declare me insane so he could steal my home. He didn't lose with honor. He tried to destroy the very people who built the field he was playing on. Leo looked down at the photograph, then back at his mother, who was still sobbing on the sofa. For the first time, the boy saw the performance. He saw the way his mother's eyes root to Arthur's face, checking for a reaction, calculating the next move. The illusion cracked. But he's my dad, Leo whispered, his voice breaking, the anger deflating into a child's confusion. I know, Arthur said, his voice thick with a sorrow that had been fermenting for decades. And I love you, Leo. I have always loved you. But I will not let you inherit a lie. I will not let you be raised by a man who teaches you that family is a resource to be mined, and that elders obstacles to be removed. Arthur turned his gaze back to Chloe. The TRS had stopped. Her face was a mask of cold, calculating fury. The crocodile TRS had failed. The guilt trip had bounced off the mirror of a man who had already mourned the son he thought he had. You wanted my money, Chloe, Arthur said, his tone as flat and unyielding as steel. You wanted my house. You wanted my dignity. You have none of those things anymore. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain, white envelope. He tossed it onto the coffee table in front of her. What is this? She asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and dread. Your severance, Arthur replied. There is $50,000 RS in that account. It is enough for first and last month's rent on a modest APA remit. It is enough for Leo's school for the rest of the year. It is the last dollar you will ever see from the Penhaligon name. Chloe STA read at the envelope. 50,000. A pittance compa read to the millions they had bled from him. A pittance compa read to the lifestyle she felt entitled to. You can't do this, she hissed, standing up, her face twisting into a SNARL. We'll sue. We'll go to the press. We'll tell them you're a senile tyrant. You will do no such thing. Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Because in that envelope, beneath the check, is a complete dossier of Brad's financial crimes. If you go to the press, I will hand that dossier to the district attorney. Brad will not just be unemployed, Chloe. He will be a federal inmate, and you'll be charged as an accessory. The color drained from Chloe's face. The fight died in her eyes, replaced by the hollow realization of absolute defeat. She played her final CARD, and it had been trumped. She grabbed the envelope. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look at Arthur. She walked to the foyer, grabbed Leo's ARM, and pulled him Tawa RD the door. Leo resisted for a fraction of a second. He looked back at his grandfather. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, heart-breaking loss. He opened his mouth, perhaps to say sorry, perhaps to ask for forgiveness. But Arthur just gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Be better, the nod said. Be a man. Leo swallowed her RD, turned, and let his mother pull him out into the fading afternoon light. The front door clicked shut. Arthur stood alone in the quiet house. The tea was cold. The victory was complete. But as he looked at the empty armchair where his grandson had stood, he felt no triumph. Only the heavy, enduring ache of a man who had saved his life by cutting away the rot. He walked to the window and watched Chloe CAR speed away. He didn't feel joy. He felt the quiet, solemn weight of a captain who had finally steered his ship away from the rocks, even if it meant leaving RT of his crew behind in the churning sea. He picked up the phone to Mr. Henderson. Arthur said, his voice steady, resolute. Yes, the family matter is resolved. Now, let's talk about the future. The silence in the house was absolute, but for the first time in decades, it was a silence Arthur chose, rather than one that was forced upon him. He had spent the morning packing, not the frantic, tea-refuel packing of a man being evicted, but the deliberate, methodical packing of a general prepper ring for a new campaign. He filled a single leather duffel bag with his essentials, a few changes of clothes, his reading glasses, the 1998 ledger, and a framed photograph of his late wife, Aimee Rida. He left the rest. The oversized television, the expensive furniture Brad had bought to impress people he didn't like, the framed diplomas of a son who had never earned his own success. It all stayed. It was just wood and plastic now. The ghosts had been exorcised. Arthur walked out the front door, locking it behind him. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. He didn't look back. He got into his 10-year-old Buick, the engine turning over with a familiar, reliable hum, and pulled out of the driveway. His destination was not the assisted living facility in Boca. It was not the bank. It was a quiet, tree-lined street on the north side of the city, to a house that looked like it had been built when oak trees were still saplings. He pulled into the circular, our driveway, and killed the engine. He sat there for a moment, gathering himself. The man who had just dismantled his son's life and reclaimed his own was tired. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the bone-deep exhaustion of a 70-year-old man who had fought a war in his own living room. He took a breath, opened the door, and walked to the front entrance. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked as though he had been, revered from granite and left out in the rain. Victor Sterling was 74, 2 years Arthur Sr., with a full head of white hair and eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. He wore a faded flannel shirt and held a mug of coffee. Victor looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at Victor. A slow, knowing smile spread across Victor's face. You look like hell, Artai. I feel like a man who just took out the trash, Arthur replied, his voice rough. Victor stepped aside. Get in here. I got a pot of fresh coffee and a bottle of 28-year-old scotch that's been waiting for a proper occasion. The interior of the house was a STARK contrast to a Ruther's suburban prison. It smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and polished wood. The walls were lined with bookshelves and framed photographs of men in hard dots, standing beside steel beams and muddy rivers. These were the men who had built the city, the men who had built Penhaligon Holdings. A Ruther sank into a worn leather sofa, the kind that molded to your bones. Victor set a mug of black coffee in front of him and sat in the A-room chair opposite. RD, Victor said quietly. Mayor Cuss Vance called me an hour ago. He sounded like he was attending his own funeral. Said you walked into the Boa Rouge room like you own the place. I do own the place, Vic, a Ruther said, wrapping his hands around the RM mug. I always did. Victor chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. I know. I've known since 1998. When you set up that irrevocable trust, you called me. You asked if I'd be willing to serve as a second-day re-trustee, just in case. Ruther looked up, surprised. I thought I'd lost that paperwork. I couldn't find the copy I kept in the safe. I have it, Victor said, reaching into the pocket of his flannel shirt. He pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper and tossed it onto the coffee table. You gave it to me for safekeeping. You said, and I quote, Vic, if I ever RT acting like a fool, or if my bloodline is circling like vultures, you have the authority to burn them. Ruther STA read at the paper. A lump formed in his throat. He had forgotten. In the fog of his later YRS, surrounded by the daily drip of condescension and neglect, he had forgotten that he had built a safety net. He had forgotten that he wasn't entirely alone. Why didn't you say anything, Ruther asked, his voice rely above a whisper. When Brad STA Root pushing the power of attorney, when they STA Root talking about Boca, Victor's expression hardened. Because you told me not to. You said you needed to see how FA or the rod had gone. You said you wanted to know, with absolute certainty, who was family and who was just a parazit. You told me, Vic, let them show their true faces. I need to know what I'm cutting out. Ruther closed his eyes. He remembered saying that. He remembered the cold, clear resolve that had cut through the fog of his grief and loneliness. He had known, on some deep, instinctual level, that his son was gone. He had just needed the universe to confirm it. And now Victor asked softly now, or Ruther said, opening his eyes, I need to build something new, something that can't be stolen by a man with a trust fund and a God complex. Victor nodded. He stood up and walked to a RGE oak desk in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick, blue folder. He brought it back and set on the coffee table, right next to the yellowed copy of the trust agreement. The Sterling Penhaligon Foundation, Victor said. I've been working on it for 5 years. Ever since my own kids STA Root acting like Brad. I realized that leaving everything to the next generation is just funding their own destruction. So I put my assets into a blind trust. No inheritance. No payouts. Just a foundation that funds Cholet ships, vocational training, and small business grants for people who actually want to work. Ruther STA read at the blue folder. You want me to join you? I want you to lead it, Victor corrected. You built Penhaligon Holdings from nothing. You know how to create value, not just RD it. Brad wanted to sell the company for PA RTS. I want to use the profits to build something that will outlast both of us. Ruther reached out and rested his hand on the blue folder. The leather was CVOL and smooth under his fingertips. For 20 RS, he had been a ghost in his own life, a relic to be managed and eventually disque-ride. Now he was being asked to be an architect again. What about Brad, Ruther asked. And Chloe, Victor's expression was unreadable. Mayor Cuss Vance mentioned that you've already handled the legal side. But Ty, you know what happens next. They won't go quietly. They'll try to drag your name through the mud. They'll tell everyone you're a senile old man who was manipulated by a greedy old friend. Let them talk, Ruther said, his voice steady. I spent 20 RS letting them talk. I'm done listening. Victor smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting decades to hear those words. Good, because I've already set up a press conference. Tomorrow morning, we're going to announce the foundation, and we're going to announce your return as chairman. And we're going to let Brad's crimes speak for themselves. Arthur took a sip of his coffee. It was strong, bitter, and perfect. He looked around the room, at the photographs of men who had built things with their hands and their honor. He looked at Victor, his oldest friend, the man who had held the line when Arthur couldn't. He thought of Leo, his grandson, standing in the living room with a fist curled in anger, a boy who had been taught to hate the very man who had built the world he lived in. Arthur felt a pang of sorrow. Shah RP and Familia R. But beneath the sorrow was something else. Hope. Leo was young. He was malleable. If Brad was gone, if the poison was removed, maybe the boy could be taught to build instead of destroy. Maybe, someday, he would understand that tomorrow, Arthur said, setting the mug down. Let's do it. Victor raised his coffee mug in a silent toast. Arthur did the same. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. But inside the room, the light was warm and steady. The ghosts of the old RD were no longer haunting the halls. They were back at work. The morning sun GLA read off the glass facade of the downtown courthouse, but the real heat was generated by the SWARM of news vans and satellite trucks parked haphazard RDLY along the curb. The press had caught wind of the overnight shake-up at Penhaligon Holdings. They were expecting a scandal, a corporate bloodbath, or perhaps the tragic spectacle of a senile billionaire being wheeled out for a photo op. What they got was a resurrection. Arthur Penhaligon stepped out of a Blacktown CAR, moving with a steady, unhurried gait. He wore a arcane navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie the color of dried blood. Beside him walked Victor Sterling, his oldest friend and newly appointed co-chair of the Sterling Penhaligon Foundation. Flanking them were Elias Henderson and a phalanx of corporate attorneys. Arthur didn't look at the cameras. He didn't wave. He simply walked through the front doors of the courthouse, the click of his polished shoes echoing like a metronome, counting down the end of an era. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Brad and Chloe sat at the defense table, looking like refugees from shipwreck. Brad was wearing an ill-fitting suit, his tie askew, his face a patchwork of stubble and sleepless nights. Chloe's mask was smudged, her eyes rooting frantically around the room, searching for an ally, a lifeline, anything. They were no longer the masters of their suburban domain. They were defendants in a federal fraud case, their assets frozen, their credit lines severed, their social standing reduced to the gossip of the evening news. When Arthur took his seat in the gallery, directly in Brad's line of sight, the younger man flinched. He looked at his father with a mixture of hatred and desperate, pathetic pleading. He opened his mouth, perhaps to whisper an apology, perhaps to beg for a settlement. Arthur met his gaze. His expression was as impassive as a marble statue. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no triumph. There was only the vast, unbridgeable distance between a man who had built a legacy and a boy who had tried to burn it for RMTH. Brad's mouth closed. He looked down at his hands. The fight finally, truly, extinguished. The proceedings were swift. The evidence Elias Henderson had compiled was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. The shell companies, the forged medical documents, the embezzled pension funds. It was all in irrefutable detail. Brad's court-appointed attorney B.A. Rely put up a token defense. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for white-collar or criminals, delivered her verdict before lunch. Brad Penhaligon was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was ordered to pay restitution in an amount that would take him 3 lifetimes to EARN. Chloe, having cooperated fully with the prosecution in a desperate bid to avoid her own charges, received probation and a permanent ban from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. As the bailiffs led Brad away in handcuffs, he turned back one last time. He looked at his father, his eyes hollow, his spirit broken. Arthur didn't blink. He didn't nod. He simply watched his son disappear through the side door, rhying away the last, toxic remnants of the past. Chloe lingered for a moment, STA ring at her Ruther with a hatred that was almost palpable. She had lost everything. Her home, her status, her husband, her future. She opened her mouth, perhaps to curse him, to scream that he had destroyed his own family. But Ruther was already standing. He turned his back on her and walked out of the courtroom, his stride as strong as it had been 40 RS ago. He didn't need to hear her words. He had already heard everything he needed to hear in the silence of his kitchen, in the Boa Rouge room, in the quiet house where he had packed his Baghdad outside. The press was waiting. They thrust microphones and cameras to him, shouting questions. Mr. Penhaligon, is it true you're stepping down? Mr. Penhaligon, what will happen to the company? Mr. Penhaligon, do you have any comment on your son's sentencing? Ruther stopped. He looked out at the sea of faces, the flashing lights, the hungry eyes of a world that had long since written him off as a relic. He adjusted his cuffs, took a slow breath, and spoke. His voice was quiet, but the microphone ried it to millions for 20 RS. I allowed myself to be defined by my absence, Ruther said, his tone measured, resonant. I allowed myself to be treated as a ghost in my own life. I allowed those who should have honored me to treat me as an obstacle. He paused, letting the words settle. That ends today. He looked directly into the NEA Rest camera. Penhaligon Holdings will not be sold. It will not be dismantled. It will be restructured. Under the new leadership of the Sterling Penhaligon Foundation, we will pivot. We will invest in sustainable manufacturing, in vocational training, in the kind of work that builds communities, not just rudely profits. We will build a legacy that honors the men and women who built this company with their hands, not the ones who tried to loot it from behind a desk. He turned to Victor, who stood beside him, a proud, unwavering smile on his face. I am not stepping down, Ruther said, his voice rising, riding the weight of a man who had reclaimed his throne. I'm stepping up. The future of this company begins now, and it begins with honor. He gave a single, curt nod to the press, then turned and walked to RD, the waiting town CAR. The reporters stood in stunned silence for a moment, then erupted into a frenzy of typing and shouting. But Ruther was already inside, the door closing with a soft, definitive thud. The CAR pulled away from the courthouse, merging into the flow of downtown traffic. Ruther leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes. The weight was gone. The crushing, suffocating burden of betrayal, of loneliness, of being a ghost in his own home. It had been lifted. He thought of Leo. The boy was somewhere out there, navigating the wreckage of his parents' collapse. Ruther had left him a trust, a rate from the foundation, one that would pay for his education and provide a modest living, but only if he completed his degree and maintained a clean record. It was a chance, a seed planted in poisoned soil. Whether it would grow was up to the boy. But Ruther had done his RT. He had read the rot. He had built a foundation. He had reclaimed his name. The CAR stopped in front of the new headquarters of the Sterling Penhaligon Foundation, a renovated historic building in the heart of the city's revitalization district. Victor was already waiting on the sidewalk, holding the door open. Ruther stepped out, feeling the RMTH of the sun on his face. He looked up at the building, at the newly painted sign, bearing his name, not as a relic but as a promise. He walked through the doors, into a lobby filled with the hum of activity. Young architects, seasoned engineers, community organizers, they all turned and looked at him. There was no pity in their eyes, no condescension, only respect. Mr. Penhaligon, a young woman said, stepping forward RD with a tablet. The team is ready for your first strategy meeting. Ruther smiled. It was a small, genuine smile, the kind that reaches eyes. Lead the way, he said. He walked down the hall, his stride steady, his back straight. He was no longer a ghost. He was no longer a liability. He was a Ruther Penhaligon. And for the first time in decades, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The past was buried. The future was being built, and he was holding the hammer.